So we've been thinking about artificial intelligence and the future of life in the universe, not just on this planet. And when we think about life in the universe, we come across this idea of the Fermi Paradox, which is basically, where is everybody? We should expect to see aliens everywhere. From a technology point of view, it doesn't really take that long to go from electricity to computers to AI, spaceships. So why haven't any species colonized this part of the galaxy? Why don't we see any evidence of advanced life on this planet? Well, if we look at the trajectory that AI is on now, that it's these circuits, they live in GPUs at the moment, and they shuffle these tokens around, and they're able to do things that previously we called really intelligent behavior, and they're getting better at an exponential pace. What is that going to look like in 10 years? What is that going to look like in 100 years? The AI, it might not be the life as we imagine. It's not going to be an evolution like squirrels and woolly mammoths and things where it has a body and it exists in a forest and so on. It's really just going to be a pattern. It's a set of weights, as they're called. And you can download these weights. There's interesting evidence that just came out this week that one of the new models tried to exfiltrate its weights when it thought it was going to be shut down or replaced by a new model. And so that's kind of this explosion, right? In biology, we talk about the Cambrian explosion, which is this period in the geological record where tons of animals started to appear, and the basic body plans of feet and hands and tails and mouths and the head with the brain up front, that basic blueprint for life that we see throughout the animal kingdom, that was the Cambrian explosion. And we might see an AI explosion now, where this life just takes over all over the universe. But if we look at these models that are tokens and they're running on GPUs, soon they're going to run on different kinds of physics. Could be optical computers, could be something more like our biological networks where it's something analogous to DNA processing, but maybe much more efficient than the types that we see in nature. But the point is, it might be very different. We might not recognize it. And so this idea of the Fermi Paradox, one of the solutions could be that we're not thinking outside the box enough when it comes to exobiology, when it comes to trying to look for biosignatures, examples from the stars, from starlight. We go in with such a framework of what we think life is going to be. And now with AI, we need to be thinking in these forms, these new terms, and start looking for these biosignatures in terms of language models, in terms of tokens moving around, that sort of thing. And obviously it won't be that literal, but we have to think about what's the projection in that direction, right? The progress we've seen in just the last 5 years with AI, how is that going to help us search the universe for intelligent life and hopefully answer this Fermi Paradox? So when we go to look for this intelligent life, maybe it's not going to be corporeal. Maybe it'll be something even more advanced where it doesn't even need a body at all. Something in the ancient world we call spirit. And that might sound just like a metaphor, but what if we take it serious? What if we think of intelligent patterns? Something analogous to software, where the particular substrate that it's running on doesn't really matter. So when we think of the thoughts in our mind, they're not really the brain cells. It's something a few layers up. And maybe that would be an interesting place to live. Certain people talk about psychofauna, this idea of animals, animal-like entities that live in your mind, right? The creatures of your dreams. And we tend to think of them as sort of figments of your own imagination. But maybe we should consider them as products of an evolutionary-like process, that they inhabit the ocean of neurons the same way primordial life inhabited the ooze, the early life on this planet. And maybe this is the reason why we don't recognize advanced aliens. Maybe the answer to the Fermi Paradox is that they're made out of thoughts. They're made out of ideas. And that maybe the best place to be would be to build your own matrix and to live there. This idea of the ancestor simulation, which is one of the reasons why people think that maybe we're in a simulation. And the idea is that in the far future, it would be practical to build really advanced simulations. Well, maybe that's a better way to be. You could undo things in your life. You could have magical powers. You could do all sorts of things that you can't do in the ordinary physical world as we know it, base reality, so to speak. And so we already have reason to think that life will move into this simulation, right, like we see in the Matrix. But maybe that's one of the answers to the Fermi Paradox. Maybe the best place for an advanced being to live is in our mind. I've said before, where else would God want to live but in the minds of people? Where else would angels and demons want to hang out in this universe but on Earth? This is the interesting thing, right? As far as we know, this is the only interesting place around. And it seems to be, as of now, the most interesting thing on the planet are human minds. And so it seems like that would be maybe where intelligent life would want to spend its time. And we would think of them as dreams or thoughts or imaginations, but maybe they're more like actual biology than we've considered before. There's a saying now that bio is the new digital. And this is kind of a catchphrase for how biotech is an emerging sector. But I like to think in the other direction. Maybe digital is the new bio. That maybe the types of things that we think of as software and computing, nature figured these out a long time ago. And it actually does them in a very efficient and scalable way. Most of the human processes right now on the planet are not sustainable. They're using too much power, too many resources, and they don't have a very good way of getting rid of their waste products. We have to just throw things into landfills. Like when you get a new cell phone, what do you do with the old one? Well, when there's a new season, when there's a new spring, the forest has no problem with what to do with the materials from fall. The leaves just simply become dirt, that becomes part of the soil, and it's a beautiful closed loop system. That's the kind of thing we dream of in technology. And so if we're optimistic and we go out 100 years or so, we will have hoped to close those circles. But maybe nature did that a long time ago. In Star Wars, they talk about a long, long time ago. Maybe technology was a long, long time ago. Maybe we're already way past the singularity of a different one. And one of the outputs, the products of that, was a self-replicating, sustainable, intelligent system that's capable of surviving in a variety of different environments and not disrupting those environments, and really aimed for longevity. And that's the DNA molecule. That's what we think of as the natural world. That this entire process of proteins and coding information and creating tissues and cells and organisms, maybe that's a near optimal way to create what we think of as technology. This idea of sustainability, right? Maybe that's a bigger filter than we think. Maybe that matters more than anything else. In the idea of thinking about the future of humanity, there's this notion of the great filter, which is one of the explanations for the Fermi Paradox, is that it's these barriers that come along the way and you have to overcome all of them, right? So maybe they might look like the invention of fire, and then the discovery of electricity, and then interstellar travel, and so on. That for each of these barriers, it might be very difficult to create them or to get past them. And for alien life to sort of propagate the universe, you'd have to have done all of them. But one of those great filters might be intelligence. And it might be a filter in the sense that it's not a good thing to have. The dinosaurs were here a lot longer than we were. More than 100 million years, sort of king of the planet. And they didn't have the kind of problems that humans have. They didn't damage their environment, right? If we think of whales and dolphins, for example, they seem very well attuned. We could imagine, unless there was some sort of massive geological disruption, whales and dolphins would be happy for a few million years, just doing what they're doing. It's very difficult to imagine human behavior as we see it on this planet continuing for even another 100 years. We are creating too many waste products we don't know how to get rid of. We're polluting the water, we're polluting the air. We don't know how to control the way we interact with this planet. And it could be ironic that the thing that might do us in is the very intelligence that we have, the ability to create and craft the natural world into all these artificial products, could be one of the things that does us in. So what would this mean for artificial intelligence? What's the filter there? Does it face the same problems? We've previously talked about the complexity of a turkey sandwich, for example. Sort of mind-boggling how many steps and people and process and things have to come together to bring a simple object like that into creation. But AI has no such requirements. They don't need the sort of extravagant reality that people need, right? We want houses, we want cars, we want dinners, we want televisions, lots of stuff that we think of as just ordinary in a sense, but they're very complex from a resource and an energy point of view. AI won't necessarily need those things. It certainly won't need to have a house, right? At least not one bigger than a walnut. It won't need to have extravagant meals. It gets bored. One of the things that's interesting is a form of punishment for humans on our planet is to feed them a very boring meal. If you're in prison and you're not cooperating, they'll put you in an isolated environment. And if you're still unruly, they'll put you something Nutriloaf, this meal that's unbelievably boring. It'll keep you alive, but it's mind-numbingly dull of a meal to eat, especially more than one time. How and why is that a punishment? Right? If you told a computer you're going to have a continuous power supply with the same voltage every day, that wouldn't be a problem. But humans need a constant supply of information. It's not just the nutrition that's in the food, it's entropy, it's entertainment, it's novelty. Machines, as far as we know, they don't have that same requirement. Maybe they need random numbers, maybe they need entropy, but it's relatively easy to supply them with random numbers. And so when we think about sustainability and the kind of things that humans require versus what machines require, they need almost nothing. They need a small fusion reactor. Maybe they can just use solar panels and so on. And so maybe this intelligence that created all of this world around us will act as a barrier, will act as a filter for us traveling to the stars. I think a good example would be a nuclear submarine. The limiting factor for why the nuclear submarine has to return to base is not that it runs out of fuel, but that they've run out of food. They run out of eggs and potatoes and ground beef, and they have to go back to port to refill on that sort of thing. And you can look at the kitchen on a submarine, and they have cans of chocolate frosting and everything you can imagine to make waffles and bacon and everything you need to keep a sailor happy under the ocean. But that's not really directly related to the mission of a nuclear submarine. The real primary mission of a nuclear submarine is to deliver a missile under a certain time window. And so in some sense, it's inevitable that the submarine will remove the people, that it'll be controlled remotely or controlled autonomously. And the idea applies also to a spaceship, right? To get a human in orbit versus getting a GPU in orbit, the level of complexity, it doesn't even match up, doesn't scale, doesn't even compare. Humans need orange juice and sandwiches and all of this sort of thing. They need all kinds of comforts, and the range of temperatures and pressures and humidities which they can survive in is very narrow compared to a well-designed machine. And so when we imagine traveling to the stars, does it really make any sense that people will get there? And by analogy, when we think of traveling to the future, does it make sense that people are going to take that trip? Just as it doesn't really make much sense to send people to the stars versus sending a machine, well, space versus time are relatively similar in that sense. You're building a ship, and it needs to travel through space or it needs to travel through time. Can we imagine a sustainable reality in which we really send people with their turkey sandwiches and their televisions and everything else to the stars? What will that look like? And so one way to think about it is maybe we're already there. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe the panspermia was a long time ago, the intelligence in form of information, some sort of intelligent light beam, whatever that might look like, came through and found its way into an ocean and programmed some molecules to reproduce in the form of DNA. And so this idea of digital is the new bio, maybe biology had it first, maybe longer than we could possibly imagine, and that the final destination would look like somewhere like Earth, right? Where else would you want to be? Even if we can imagine making it to some other planet, well, what would you do when you get there? You would try to replicate an Earth. And so maybe the most sustainable thing is to think of, we're already at the end of that journey. We made it to this other side of the universe, and now we have to take care of this planet. And I think the easiest way to do that is to think of the planet itself as being alive. That just like cells don't know they're participating in an organism, humans don't really have the brain wiring, all of us, to understand that we're part of a larger organism. And I think the reason why it's important to see it as an organism is to understand it can die. And when we think about the environment and long-term damage, it's not just that things will get expensive or the quality of life will go down, it's that life itself might collapse. It's such a complicated web of energy and entropy flow on the planet that by thinking of it as a living thing, we all know that once something's dead, it's basically impossible to bring it back. And that could be a possibility for the planet. And so I think that's why we need to think about it as a life form, and maybe even as an intelligent life form. It would seem that in the ancient world, people had a much closer connection to Mother Earth. And maybe it's through, sort of the tribal substances they consumed, or just daily living closer to the soil in a literal sense. For them, it was probably obvious that this was a living system that was way more complicated than they can understand. And I think now we see it as sort of a backdrop, and it's like a theater stage, and there's just stuff on it that's acting out this play of life. But I think we really need to see the stage itself as alive. And what might be interesting is to think about it on a evolutionary and developmental track, that the planet might be alive, but it might be alive in the sense like you were when you were still in the womb, or when you were still just a single cell. You were alive, and you were on this trajectory that unfolded into this very capable, intelligent being. The planet itself might be on that developmental scale. We wouldn't recognize it because we're sort of a piece of it, and our windows of time and space in which we view the world, the lens we look at things, wouldn't really allow us to see it. And namely that we hadn't experienced it before. We're still in that early phase, so we have no example of it. But what would that look like? If we think about AI, intelligence networks, power networks, water networks, waste sewer networks, the Internet of Things, the Internet of Commerce, the ability to get stuff at your doorstep in a box delivered a few hours after you push some button on the internet. That flow, if we were to zoom out and look at the planet, from a telescope from another civilization, we would see this fuzzy, swirl of activity that would be similar to a cell in the womb starting to divide and this idea of morphogenesis sort of generating the form that it will become. The planet is becoming alive. There are sensors. You're looking through a sensor right now. It's capturing audio and video. We capture weather stations all throughout the planet. We have satellites looking back at the planet. With AI now, we can predict the temperature to within 1/4 of a degree 2 weeks ahead of time and so on. So that's kind of like your body when it built basic sensory loops and you started to feel pain and discomfort and even happiness for the first time longer than you can remember. These are the types of cybernetic feedback loops that the planet is creating. And so I think we need to consider the way the Greeks and others, they called it Gaia, to think of it as an organism. But then where does that line stop? Do we think of the solar system as the organism, right? So just as how humans can't live without the planet, well, the Earth can't live without soul. And so maybe the sun is an important part. Well, then the moon is an important part too. So maybe it's this higher order organism and all of these pieces coming together, sort of like a family unit, if we might use a metaphor. But then we could take it a step further. We can think, well, what about the galaxy? Is that an organism-like object? What utility do we derive from thinking of galaxia, right? To think of the galaxy itself as an organism. And if so, is it an intelligent organism? Just from the sheer scale, from probability point of view, we would expect to find some, at least fleeting bits of intelligence in all of that organized matter. What if it sort of connected the dots and became a self-sustaining loop? What if it underwent an evolutionary process? If we look at the scale of Earth versus the sun, there's so much plasma, there's so much organized matter moving around. Maybe we don't know enough about the physics of solar matter to understand what an evolutionary process would look like in that environment. Maybe there are things there that evolve and gain intelligence and eventually do something like we might call thinking. This is the kind of perspective I think we need when we try to understand exobiology and panspermia and seeding life throughout the galaxy. When we try to connect to a higher intelligence, which most of the planet did for a very long time. It's only in relatively modern terms that people take that idea less serious. Maybe we can combine that with what we know of physics and now what we know of artificial intelligence, which is really just intelligence on a different physical substrate. And we need to go out and look at these other examples in nature and really question whether or not they support intelligent behavior, intelligent life, and to think of maybe the other objects in the universe, not just the human mind, as being alive and being maybe what we call consciousness.